Howdy, and welcome to the F1 Hatchet, and welcome to my Stack Up series. Today we'll be talking about Alpine, and how well they stacked up against those constructors around them. So we'll be comparing them against Haas and Aston Martin, as well as talking about how the drivers stacked up against the drivers in the championships around them. So we'll talk about the three drivers and where they ended up in the constructor standings, and compare them to the people ahead of them and the people behind them, and kind of figure out where they played out and how those trend lines work throughout the season. We'll be starting off with some general statistics for the Alpine and its three drivers this season. As you can see here, they finished in that 6th constructor's position. They had an average starting position of 15th on the grid and finished 13th. So they had a total of 6 DNFs. Now the DNFs doesn't mean crashes necessarily. It could be that they had broken parts or they got beached in the gravel, just something that they didn't actually complete the race in. As you can see, they were able to start and gain a few positions on average throughout these races, but they weren't in that right spot to gain a number of points that they really needed to be competitive in that constructor's standing. Now they got lucky in Brazil and gave them quite a bit of points, but besides that, that 13th finish position on average is kind of far outside that point range. And so you can kind of get a gauge of how Alpine did this season. And they were able to really take advantage, truly advantage, in a couple of races to get them those points that they needed to get bumped up into that 6th position on the constructor's standing. Now we'll break this down into 3 drivers. So we start off with Pierre Gasly, whose driver's position was 10th on the driver's standing. He had an average starting position of 13th and an average finish position of 11th. So just outside those point range. So he was the one that's kind of edging on those points for most of the time, able to gain those points when needed on those rare occasions when something else happened in that race that was able to take advantage of. He also had 4 of the 6 DNFs for the team. Now, if we move on to his teammate for the most of the season, Esteban Ocon, his driver's standing was from 14th. His average starting position was 14th, and his average finishing position was 13th. And he had 2 of those DNFs. So he's able to gain ground as well, but he was kind of farther back in the pack, not quite able to take advantage of as many of those opportunities to gain points as his teammate was. And we had Jack Doohan coming into that single race at the very end, who finished in 24th position on the driver's standings. He started off in 17th on average and ended in 15th on average. And he had 0 DNFs because he only raced a couple of races. So he didn't have the opportunity to really, mess up too much. And he was able to take advantage of those that he actually did race in. So he was farther back in the pack, but he was more there for trying to show and prove that he could be there for this next season. We will start off the team drivers comparison in the sprint races. So here you can see Pierre Gasly versus Esteban Ocon for the 6 sprint races that we had this season. And we can see that those trend lines for each of those, and where Pierre Gasly was gaining ground as that slope was going down, which is the finishing position of what they wanted to be in. So downward is better than upward. And you see Esteban Ocon slightly upward, so he was getting kind of slightly worse throughout the season. Now, I know he had a lot of issues with the Alpine team this year, and it really kind of showed, I think, in his attitude and how they were playing out in this full season. He was trying to do a decently job, but he didn't quite gain what he needed to out of that tweaking of that Alpine car throughout the season. So he's kind of had more of a steady trend line for him throughout the season on those sprint races, where we see Pierre Gasly gaining ground. Now they had pretty big wide swings. As you can see here, Pierre Gasly started off pretty bad, had a really good race in Miami, had a couple other bad races, had another really good race in Brazil, and not quite as bad, but started going back in Qatar. But that same kind of pattern for Esteban Ocon as he was going through these races as well, but just not quite as wide of a range on where he ended up from race to race. But anyway, if you compare those, you can really see that Pierre Gasly started off worse than Esteban Ocon at the very beginning of the season, but was quickly able to gain ground and improve and get the most of that Alpine throughout the season. Now, focusing more on Pierre Gasly on these sprint races, we'll compare him against Nico Hülkenberg and Fernando Alonso, those drivers who are around him in the Drivers' Championship. And you can see this wild graph here where both Pierre Gasly and Nico Hulkenberg were kind of starting off fairly poorly and had a kind of a back and forth method where Fernando Alonso started off really strong and then had a good 3 races or so that he was doing fairly poorly. And then at the very end, he was starting to come back and gain some ground in that Aston Martin. And so you see that green Aston Martin trend line going up, so that's bad. So Fernando was not real happy this season on the sprint races, and in that Aston Martin to be able to gain the most out of he could, where we see Nico Hulkenberg and Pierre Gasly, gaining ground throughout the season on those sprint races, with Nico Hulkenberg kind of edging out Pierre Gasly on that trend line view. But we also have that fact that Nico Hulkenberg actually had a DNF in Brazil on that sprint race, so he doesn't have a marker there, so he can't have a hard time comparing those 3 drivers in that one sprint race. Again, I think it's kind of interesting that we see these up and down markers for these races compared to their trend line. So they're not real tight, not real consistent. They're kind of up and down, really good or really bad in most of those cases. Moving on to look at Esteban Ocon and the drivers around him were Kevin Magnussen and Lance Stroll. So we can kind of look at those trend lines and those drivers, and you can see that Kevin Magnussen was getting much better throughout this season, whereas Lance Stroll and Esteban Ocon were kind of getting slightly worse throughout the season. They weren't gaining the ground that they really needed to really improve in those vehicles, to get those vehicles to really participate and kind of work for them instead of against them. I think there were tweaks and that they did on those cars didn't really match up to those driving styles, and they couldn't really get the most out of that throughout the season. And you can kind of compare that. If you look at all these, race finishes, you do see that, Kevin's kind of wild, and so is Lance Stroll for the most part, whereas Esteban Ocon is more consistent around that trend line. He's closer for all of his races. So I think he can kind of get the most kind of out of that, whereas the other 2 drivers had really good races or really bad races again, which kind of like had these big swings in the momentum for their race. So that could help them or could hurt them depending on their attitude for those races and where they think they could end up. And I think that kind of helps figure out where they are in that trend line and figure out the best and how much they could really get out of those cars and how much the car was affecting them in each of those races versus the driver being able to pull out and try to figure out how much they could get out of the vehicles and get the most out of those vehicles. Now we get to the more meat of the issues here on the races for the season by looking at comparing the GP races, which there's a lot more of. And since we didn't have any sprint races for Jack Doohan, we just kind of didn't have that slide in there as well. So this is kind of comparing the 3 Alpine drivers for the season, where Jack Doohan is in yellow with that one marker that he actually participated in, where we have Esteban Ocon in red and Pierre Gasly in blue. And as you can kind of look at those, you can kind of figure out how that Alpine car performed in each race. And so you can kind of figure out where those drivers were able to get the most out of that vehicle. So you kind of see the same trend lines as before, where Pierre Gasly was able to get more out of that car throughout the season and gain ground, where Esteban Ocon was more of a steady. He was still gaining ground slightly, but not quite at the rate that Pierre Gasly was. So he was kind of gaining slightly, trying to figure out how that Alpine was actually going to be able to perform, whereas Pierre Gasly was able to really take advantage of how that car was going to perform and get the most out of that Alpine. And you see the up and down for the results kind of similar between the 2 drivers. So you can kind of see that those are where the car actually performed well or didn't quite perform as well at those tracks. And you can kind of gauge those 2 drivers with that same performance value. So you can kind of see that, Esteban Ocon started ahead of Pierre Gasly, and then we kind of follow that along. But Pierre Gasly was able to take advantage around that Imola stage to really take over and get the most out of that Alpine. And that kind of performed all the way to kind of to the end, where he was on average able to get more out of that Alpine than Esteban Ocon was. And you can kind of figure that out and that rate and figure out how much that trend line was going to go. And as you can see, those last several races, Pierre Gasly was really able to take more advantage of it than Esteban Ocon. And then we had that one race that Jack Doohan stood in for Esteban Ocon, so we didn't have that 3 driver comparison. And that's where you kind of have to look at that. he's mainly there just to kind of have a complete picture as he's coming in next year, so you can maybe figure out how that might play into effect. Here we can see Pierre Gasly versus Nico Hülkenberg versus Fernando Alonso in the GP races. And again, you see kind of a up and down finishing positions for a lot of the drivers, kind of big wide swings for the Haas and that Aston Martin, whereas Pierre Gasly was able to kind of start off more closely to that trend line and then had a couple of bad races, but then really swept it the other direction at the very end of the season, gaining him those extra points that he really needed. Now with Nico Hülkenberg, very more consistent at the very beginning of the race, even though that very first race he was kind of off on, but very close to that 10th position, slightly out of that range, gaining points more consistently throughout that series, but not quite as good as what he needed to be. Then he had several bad races, and it was, again, kind of consistent around that 10th position at the end of the season, whereas Pierre Gasly was very off at the very beginning of the season, had a good middle sector where he started gaining a few points here and there, and at the very end, he gained some significant points that pushed him up and over Nico Hülkenberg. Now, if you compare Pierre Gasly against Fernando Alonso, they're kind of a wide swing at the very beginning. So you have Alonso doing much better than Pierre Gasly at the beginning of the season. At that middle part, they're almost comparatively, even though they're a little bit of off and on with Fernando Alonso. As Alonso was kind of steadying out, Pierre Gasly was able to really take advantage of those positions as well and get those huge points when he really needed it to kind of get up and be a threat to Fernando Alonso on that driver's standings. So you can kind of get that edge, kind of look at those positions and where they were on each race, and kind of figure out how they, played out throughout the season, and kind of get a general idea of how they, those cars were able to perform and where they were able to gain the ground and get the most out of those vehicles compared to each driver. Now moving on to compare Esteban Ocon against those drivers around him in the GP races, we see it a little bit farther up in the finishing positions for all of those drivers. Even though Lance Stroll started off the season a little bit stronger than the other two drivers, he ended up falling back about mid-season and not regaining that ground at the end of the season as either. So he kind of tailed off, and you can see that in that trend line. Started off decent, ended up kind of closer to that 15th mark for on average for his finishing position, kind of falling off and not gaining the points he needed to stay steady into that top range of that finishing drivers championship. Whereas Kevin Magnussen and Esteban Ocon are fairly close on those trend lines. They started off fairly bad, but were gaining ground throughout the season for both of those drivers. Maybe not quite as fast as they would like, but they can kind of follow that same pattern. And they both kind of crossed that era for that drivers championship against Lance Stroll at that mid-season. Now, Lance Stroll had more points at the beginning, so that kind of helped him out and keep him in that running for that drivers championship, and that's why he ended up ahead of these two drivers. You can kind of compare that and figure out if that season continued, where that trend would look like it was going to end up overall, and kind of the comparison of these drivers in this season. And again, you can kind of look at where they finished for each of those drivers and each of those teams and kind of get an idea potentially of how those cars performed in each of those races, and if the driver could really take advantage of those situations or not. Lastly, we'll look at Jack Doohan versus Logan Sargeant for those drivers that ended up at the very back of the pack. We kind of had a weird mixture here because we had Logan Sargeant perform at the very beginning of the season and get dropped about 2/3. And then you have Jack Doohan coming in for that one race at the very end. Don't really have a trend line for Jack Doohan because he only had one race that we could kind of look at here. But if you look at Logan Sargeant's, he was getting better slowly, not quite as fast as he needed to. And that's kind of why he got dropped off. He also had a lot of DNFs, which kind of hurt him in that running as well, as he wasn't getting the positions and costing the team a lot more money in that run for potential wrecks or other things that they had to do for that vehicle. But you could also look at that as well and see Jack Doohan coming in on that Alpine, and his one race that he was able to perform still outscored Logan Sargeant for most of that season in that, finishing position spot wise. So it's kind of right there, that edge. So hopefully Jack Doohan can, pull out some more next season and, take that advantage the ability to get in that Alpine a lot more and get familiarized with how that car interacts with the tracks to gain more of an advantage over the people around him next season. And I'm looking forward to seeing how he performs or if he gets dropped in the season in 2025. Now we make our way over to the team standings and where they got the points for each race, and this is basically what that graph is. So the more points is the better thing, so the trend line going up is better in this case, not going down, because we're looking at the more points throughout the season. So you want that trend line gaining ground and not plateauing or going downwards throughout this season. And as you can see here, between Alpine, Haas, and Aston Martin, you can see that Aston Martin started off strong. It was kind of really steady for most of the races. They had a couple of downturns in this season, but were able to gain points through most of the season from the beginning to the end. Now they kind of tailed off as the season went on, and so you see their trend line going down. So that's bad. So they weren't able to keep up with the other teams around them, but they gained some points at the very beginning that kept them in that standing for most of the season, and were able to hold off the teams that were coming up at the very end of their season in that constructor standing. Now you have Haas, who started off with a few points here, gained some decent points in that middle section in Austria, and gained a few more in Circuit of the Americas at the end. Whereas you see Alpine having a really bad start, only gaining a couple of points here and there, like in Miami and Monaco, and then kind of not really gaining anything else throughout the season, but then had that really breakout in Brazil where they gained a ton of points. And then they had some more good point ranges at the end in Qatar and Abu Dhabi, which elevated them in that constructor standings above Haas. So they ended up doing fairly well, even though they had a very poor start. Whereas Aston Martin had a very steady run, doing fairly decent from the start, but slowly tailing off, not able to keep up with the other teams. And so they started regaining less and less points throughout the season. Even more, it's more steady than the other two teams that we see here. And again, you can see those trend lines for Haas and Alpine gaining ground, with Alpine having a very nice steady slope up throughout the season, showing that they were really kind of fixed that car by the end of the season, where they were not there at the very beginning. And Aston Martin, almost the opposite, where they were kind of really competitive at the very beginning of the season and were kind of slowly tailing off, not able to make those tweaks, make those upgrades to be in that same position throughout the season, so losing grounds to the teams around them. And finally here we see the same data, but we have it in a step graph format, so we can kind of see where they gain points and how they were overtaking other teams and how close they were getting into other teams at what point in the season. So you can see Aston Martin started off strong, kind of plateaued a little bit near the end of the season, so they weren't gaining as many points at that mid-season onward, but they had enough points in there to really easily hold off the two other teams, Haas and Alpine. Now Haas started off decently, gaining the advantage on Alpine early on, but then kind of plateaued, gained a few more points in that Great Britain race that elevated them above Alpine again, tailed off, and then Alpine was able to overtake them, in that end run, starting off in Brazil, gaining the ground, pulling that gap out, and then able to get those extra points in Qatar and Abu Dhabi that really pushed them ahead of the Haas overall in that constructor standing. So you kind of get an idea of how those teams played out against each other. So Aston Martin really didn't have to worry about too much about Haas and Alpine in this, comparison, but the two other teams, Alpine and Haas, were really competing against each other fairly much throughout the whole season, where Haas had the advantage at the very most of the season, but kind of lost out at the very end, not be able to really take advantage of those last several races to get the points that they really needed to stay ahead of Alpine. So that concludes the stack up for Alpine. So what's coming up next is the stack up for Aston Martin. And so we'll be comparing Aston Martin against those constructors around them, as well as Stroll and Fernando Alonso around those drivers in the Drivers' Championship that they ended up in. So if you'd like to see that, I'd subscribe. So hopefully you get that bell icon and get the notification that when this video drops. And if you made it this far, I'd appreciate a like. And until then, I will see you on the grid.